Well, I love my wife. She's incredible,
Yeah.
a great mother.
Yeah.
The kids are healthy and happy. And of course, there's nothing more than that.
At 75 years old, Richard Gere, a man once known more for his magnetic on-screen presence than for his personal reflections, has quietly revealed the most poignant truth of his life, and it had nothing to do with fame, fortune, or film. The man who starred in iconic roles in Pretty Woman, An Officer and a Gentleman, and American Gigolo offered a simple but deeply moving confession. I didn't get divorced because they were wrong. I got divorced because I wasn't good enough to hold on. In that moment, the world didn't see a movie star, but a man finally stripped of pretense, finally at peace with a lesson it had taken decades to understand, that love is not about finding the perfect partner, but about being ready, emotionally and spiritually, to be the right partner. For decades, he had lived in the spotlight, his relationship scrutinized by the media, romanticized by the public, and ultimately misunderstood. His journey through love wasn't a series of glamorous affairs. It was a pilgrimage, often lonely, often painful, in search of emotional maturity and inner stillness. From his early days as a young musician in Pennsylvania to his transformation into Hollywood's leading man, Richard Gere always carried an air of quiet mystery, as if he was never fully present in the fame he had earned. And perhaps he wasn't. Because beneath the charm and success was a man constantly moving, through cities, through relationships, through the noise of a world that never let him breathe long enough to realize that love requires stillness. Richard Gere's earliest romances were as fleeting as they were passionate. Long before Cindy Crawford or Carey Lowell, he had already loved and lost several remarkable women. Each of these relationships carried the heat of intensity, but burned out before roots could grow. There was Carol Mallory, a model who once described him as a shooting star, dazzling and fast, but impossible to catch. There was Penelope Milford, his co-star and longtime partner through the 1970s, and Sylvia Martins, the woman who introduced him to the serenity of Buddhism in Nepal. These weren't shallow dalliances, they were emotional milestones. But Gere at that time was too restless, too unmoored to offer lasting commitment. Fame was rushing in fast. With films like Days of Heaven and American Gigolo, he became the face of a generation's desire, suave, silent, sexy. Yet while women adored him and directors praised him, Richard struggled with the growing gap between who he was and who he was pretending to be. At parties, he dazzled. In public, he charmed. But in the quiet hours alone, when the makeup came off and the applause faded, he was just a man who hadn't yet figured out how to stay. His early relationships fell apart not because they lacked love, but because he lacked the tools to sustain it. Love was a language he hadn't yet learned. And while the world saw a man on top of it all, inside, he was just beginning to realize that success in romance wasn't about conquest. It was about presence. Then came Cindy Crawford. In 1988, at a Beverly Hills barbecue hosted by famed photographer Herb Ritz, Richard met the 22-year-old supermodel who had just taken the fashion world by storm. He was 39, seasoned, famous, and already weary of the Hollywood machine. She was young, radiant, and still discovering who she was beyond the covers of Vogue and the bright lights of runways. Their connection was instant, electric, and seemingly perfect. The media couldn't get enough of them. Together, they graced magazine covers, strolled red carpets, and became the golden couple of the early 90s. But behind the flashbulbs and flawless photos, there were two very different people trying desperately to synchronize lives that were on entirely separate tracks. While Cindy juggled a whirlwind of fashion campaigns, public appearances, and identity struggles, Richard had begun his descent into quietude, seeking out Buddhism, meditating daily, and yearning for a life outside the glare of celebrity. They Married in 1991 in a spontaneous Las Vegas ceremony, using tinfoil rings and inviting no guests, just two lovers trying to simplify something inherently complex. But love, no matter how earnest, cannot bridge every divide. Cindy later admitted she tried to become the woman Richard needed, but lost herself in the process. They weren't enemies. They were strangers walking beside each other, each searching for a different kind of fulfillment. In 1995, after 4 years of trying to fit two mismatched puzzle pieces together, they divorced. No scandal, no harsh words, just silence, and two lives moving apart. Years later, Richard would reflect on that time, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I loved a woman who didn't yet know who she was, and I thought love could help her find stability. But that was an unfair expectation. It was a breakup not born of betrayal, but of bad timing, one flying, the other already trying to land. After Cindy, Richard Gere entered the quietest period of his romantic life. Gone were the tabloid photos, the flashy relationships. He turned inward, meditating in remote monasteries, engaging in humanitarian work, and acting only in films that resonated with a slower, more thoughtful pace. And then he met Carey Lowell, an actress known best for her role as a Bond girl, but far more grounded than the stereotype suggested. Carey wasn't swept away by Gere's fame. She had her own history, her own gravity, and brought with her a calm that initially matched Richard's quest for peace. They started dating in 1995, and their relationship unfolded without fanfare. By 2000, they had a son together, Homer, born when Gere was 51, and in 2002, they married in a private ceremony far from Hollywood's eyes. The family lived quietly in Pound Ridge, New York. Richard gardened. He read Buddhist texts. Carey became a full-time mom. On the surface, it seemed he had finally found what eluded him for decades: stillness, partnership, purpose. But stillness can sometimes be mistaken for stagnation. Over time, the silence between them grew, not out of anger, but from disconnection. Carey needed emotional engagement, community, and conversation. Richard continued to seek inner peace through solitude and detachment. Their paths, once parallel, started to drift. In 2013, Carey filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The proceedings lasted 3 years, not because of emotional turmoil, but due to complicated finances. Through it all, they maintained civility, agreed on custody for their son, and never aired their grievances publicly. But behind the silence, Richard began to understand something he hadn't before. When silence lasts too long, it's not peace. It's a signal. And I didn't hear it. His second marriage ended not in flames, but in quiet heartbreak, as two people simply stopped being able to touch one another's hearts. By 2014, Richard Gere had nearly vanished from the public eye. No more film festivals, no award shows, no gossip columns. Many assumed he had chosen a monk-like life of retirement and reflection, but love, as it often does, had other plans. While still finalizing his divorce from Carey, Richard briefly dated Padma Lakshmi, the well-known host of Top Chef. Their relationship wasn't splashed across headlines. There were no staged photos or PR confirmations, just quiet dinners, whispered conversations at charity events, and the kind of understated companionship that comes from shared scars. Padma, too, was recovering from emotional wounds and managing single motherhood. What they gave each other in those months wasn't passion. It was peace. It was mutual respect. But even peace must evolve, and this relationship ended as quietly as it began. A source close to both described it perfectly. Their lives were just moving in different directions. And by then, Richard had learned something crucial. Love wasn't about intensity or urgency anymore. It was about fit. It was about flow. and he was no longer interested in holding on too tightly to anything that didn't feel natural. He stopped searching, stopped hoping. He just let go. And in that stillness, after decades of dazzling love affairs, heartbreaks, lessons, and transformations, true love finally arrived. Not with fanfare, not with a grand declaration, but with a gentle presence that required no performance, no chase, no fixing. Her name was Alejandra Silva. Alejandra Silva was unlike any woman Richard had loved before, not because she was the most glamorous or the most famous, but because she arrived exactly when he was ready. A Spanish social activist with soft eyes and a quiet strength, Alejandra had just gone through her own divorce and was raising her child while leading humanitarian work in Madrid. She wasn't dazzled by Richard's legacy, nor was she seeking to be saved. She had her own inner world, one rooted in compassion and self-awareness. They met through mutual friends, but their bond was built not on shared ambition or the hunger for attention. It was built on shared values. They spoke of peace, family, compassion. They meditated together. They laughed without needing to impress. For the first time, Richard didn't need to perform, and he didn't need to search. The love he had tried to force in his younger years arrived naturally when both he and Alejandra had nothing to prove. They married in 2018 in a quiet ceremony. Since then, they've had 2 children together, and Richard has called her the true love of his life. After 3 marriages, a string of high-profile relationships, and years of soul-searching, Richard Gere has finally found a place where love isn't a struggle, it's a state of being. He's no longer chasing meaning through romance. He's simply living it. And perhaps the greatest lesson he offers at 75 is this: love doesn't always come when we're young, beautiful, or ready to conquer the world. Sometimes it comes only when we've stopped looking, when we've learned to sit still, and when we've finally become the person we were always meant to be. She once slept on the streets, not because she had to, but because she wanted to understand the pain of those who had no shelter. That's the kind of woman Alejandra Silva is, not interested in the spotlight, uninterested in recognition, but deeply committed to living with empathy. "I don't do charity work to be seen," she once said. "I do it because if I can't give my whole self to it, I'd rather not do it at all." It was this quiet strength and authenticity that drew Richard Gere back into her orbit in 2014 at a hotel owned by her family in Positano, Italy. They had met years earlier, but this time was different. Gere was slowly stepping away from his second marriage while Alejandra herself was buried in divorce papers, weary and guarded. Yet, when their eyes met again, neither saw the past. Instead, they saw the future. Not the kind of future built on glitter or headlines, but one rooted in quiet understanding and shared peace. Richard Gere didn't sweep in with grand gestures. He didn't try to win her. He simply showed up each day gently, consistently. He sent flowers, wrote little songs, and left handwritten letters, not to impress, but to say, "I'm here if you need someone beside you." Alejandra hesitated. Who wouldn't? There was a 33-year age gap, and she knew all too well the kind of public scrutiny that followed a man like Richard Gere. She didn't want to be labeled the next woman in his story, but Gere didn't try to persuade her. He didn't rush, didn't push. He just waited, not passively but with intention. His presence became a quiet rhythm in her life until one day she realized it wasn't romance he was offering. It was a home. When they married in April 2018, it was in a small Buddhist ceremony in New York, not a red carpet spectacle. Alejandra had converted to Buddhism before the wedding, not because Richard asked, but because she had discovered that the beliefs he held dear mirrored the truth she was already beginning to live. "I didn't ignore the age difference," she admitted. "But when the karmic energy between 2 people is strong enough, differences become secondary." This wasn't a fairy tale beginning. It was two lives, bruised and worn, choosing to heal together. And in an interview with Hola, she said something unforgettable. Meeting Richard Gere felt like someone reaching out, pulling me out of the dark and showing me the way. I was lost. He was the light. After the wedding, they moved into Richard's estate in Pound Ridge, the same house he once shared with his ex-wife, Carey Lowell. But this time, the house wasn't locked up emotionally. No walls, no cold silences. They left the doors open, both literally and metaphorically. They lived not as roles, not husband and wife in a traditional sense, but as true companions. In 2019, they welcomed their first son, Alexander. A year later, their second son was born, though his name remains private. What isn't private is the joy that radiates from their small family. Alejandra often shares quiet moments on social media, the boys reaching for sunlight on an autumn walk, Richard playing piano while the kids giggle, or silent snapshots of family meditation. Gere once said about her, "She's the funniest, smartest, most sensitive, brave woman who knows what she wants. I don't need her to be anyone else, and I don't need to play the perfect husband." Alejandra, in turn, calls him the kindest man I've ever met. And that's what defines them. Not perfect romance, but peaceful love. He still writes music for her every morning. He still sends flowers, not to impress, but to affirm, "I still see you." Their love works because it breathes, because neither tries to hold on too tightly. Richard doesn't demand anything of Alejandra, and she doesn't expect him to fit a mold. They move side by side, not in sync like a performance, but in harmony like a song. Two different melodies that somehow share the same soul. One is deeply introverted, drawn to silence, meditation, the inner world. The other is passionately outward, driven by activism, by justice, by the need to help others. They didn't fall in love because they were the same. They fell in love because they recognized the same rhythm in each other's hearts. This isn't the wild infatuation of youth. This is what love looks like when two people have broken and yet remain open. When neither is trying to fix the other, but both are willing to walk beside each other in peace. Richard, a man divorced 3 times. Alejandra, a woman who had survived the wreckage of her own marriage. And together, they found a way to redefine what lasting love can be. Not by holding on, but by never making the other feel they had to try to stay. In one rare moment, Richard summed it all up. "She is the most generous woman I've ever known, with others and with me." That one sentence speaks volumes. No tabloids, no dramatic interviews, no stage-managed appearances. Just a quiet man finally at peace. Some relationships are built to fill a void. Some are constructed from passion, some from compromise. But theirs? Theirs was built because they had already done the work of becoming whole. They didn't enter expecting completion. They came in already full, with no masks left to wear, no roles to play. She didn't expect Richard to be a silver screen romantic, and he didn't expect her to become the woman he had once imagined. They came together not because they needed each other, but because they could finally meet without pretending. No red carpet obligations, no publicist-approved love story. Just mornings with handwritten notes, quiet dinners, and the sound of their children laughing louder than the noise of the world. If you've ever believed love always arrives late, this story is proof that sometimes late means exactly right. Today, Richard Gere no longer lights up the big screen. He doesn't need to. At 74, he rarely appears in the press, never walks red carpets, and hasn't answered the same recycled interview questions in years. Most people don't even know what his next film is. Maybe because there isn't one. Or if there is, it's probably a quiet, independent project that doesn't need to win anything to matter. His time now is devoted to a different kind of role. Not one with lines to memorize or scenes to shoot, but one lived in complete authenticity.